We had discussions with them. We set out a reasonable offer. We stand ready to engage further with them. It was the junior doctors, sadly, who broke up the talks, who then decided to have further strike action.
So with all that in mind, what's the government's
reasonable
offer to junior doctors who have already suffered a massive 26% real terms pay cut since 2008, with almost half of them now struggling to pay their rent and mortgages? And remember, after several years of study, they've already amassed debts of about £100,000. While the
reasonable
offer is just another crappy real terms pay cut of 5%. After all our junior doctors did to keep us safe during the pandemic, that's all the Health Secretary thinks they're worth. Well, absolute bollocks to that. And it gets worse. To justify this bollocks, the Chancellor is running around UK news shows telling viewers this.
Strike action is holding back growth. It's also leading to cancelled operations and school closures. When will you resolve these disputes?
We want to resolve the public sector strikes as quickly as we can. We're prepared to be completely reasonable. We will talk about anything except measures that will entrench high inflation.
What the Chancellor is saying, unchallenged, is that our nurses and our doctors and our teachers can't be allowed inflation-busting pay rises because, in his words,
we will talk about anything except measures that will entrench high inflation.
In other words, the Chancellor is saying that the public sector workers who kept this country going during the pandemic, who've already suffered more than a decade of crappy real terms pay cuts, should accept yet another crappy real terms pay cut so the government can bring down inflation. The claim is just complete bollocks. It's been debunked over and over again by economists, but even the Prime Minister can't stop himself running around the country repeating it.
Look, the most important thing we can do to help people is to control inflation. We've got to reduce inflation. That's what's making life difficult for nurses and for everyone else in the country. And a big part of how we are going to grip and reduce inflation is by having restraint when it comes to pay settlements.
The Prime Minister's also sending out ministers to repeat it.
So, you know, one of the factors that we have to consider, particularly at a time of high inflation, is if we do inflation matching pay rises, that can actually drive inflation further.
But it's completely untrue. If a private sector company increases its wages, yes, that goes directly into the cost of making that product or service, and that might end up increasing the price. But that's not the case with public sector workers such as healthcare and education, which are free at the point of use. That means consumers do not pay for them directly, so they don't affect the inflation statistics. The Prime Minister knows that, and so does the Chancellor, now shamelessly running about UK news shows repeating it. The claim has been completely rubbished by most economists who agree it's only private sector wages that have an impact on inflation. Don't just take my word for it. Listen to Stephanie Flanders, an expert economist and head of Bloomberg News Economics, speaking to the BBC's Laura Kunsberg on April 16th.
They're concerned that inflation, which we know is putting so much pressure on people, will be bumped further up if they hand over lots more money to the public sector. As a very expert economist, does that stack up?
It is not something that economists tend to agree with, I'm sorry, because it is very different. If you have a private sector company increase its wages, well, that goes directly into the cost of making that product or service and may well then end up meaning they have to increase the price in the shops. Obviously, that's not the case with public sector workers. There isn't a price that's going to go up. Of course, there's a bill to be paid, and one always would have to ask questions about where the money's going to come from. Is it going to squeeze other things in the health? If it's going to increase health spending, which would mean it was additional, obviously there is an additional demand on the economy which could potentially increase inflation at the margins. But I think this equivalence, you know, people understand that if a private sector company raises wages, that's going to add to costs and to prices. It just isn't the same thing for public sector workers. And when you've had the kind of gap that's opened up since 2010 between public and private sector workers in terms of their pay, even with the difference of conditions and other things, you know, that is in itself an issue in terms of morale and in terms of the sort of stability of the system.
So in the government cites this is a reason for not giving our doctors, our nurses, our teachers and other public sector workers the fair pay rise we all know they deserve.
We will talk about anything except measures that will entrench high inflation.
please remember they're again talking complete bollocks.